In November 1910, 6 of the most powerful men in American finance boarded a private railcar in Hoboken, New Jersey, and disappeared for 8 days. Their families were told they'd gone duck hunting off the coast of Georgia. Newspapers, if they noticed at all, printed nothing. The men themselves went by first names only on the trip, not because they forgot their last names, but because. As one of them admitted decades later in his own published memoir, they didn't want porters or staff putting names together and realizing who was actually in that rail car at the same time. Here's the detail that should stop you before we go any further. This wasn't a secret that stayed secret. One of the 6 men who was there wrote about it himself, on the record, in a book published under his own name in 1935. He confirmed the false pretext, the first names only rule, and the reason for the secrecy, and by then it didn't matter anymore, because what those 6 men drafted during that week on Jekyll Island had already become, 3 years later, the legal foundation of the Federal Reserve System, the institution that has controlled the mechanics of American currency, interest rates, and banking regulation for more than a century since. That's not speculation. That's a documented admission, published under a real name, in a real book, sitting in libraries today. The question this episode is built to answer isn't whether that meeting happened. It did, and the man who organized the era's most powerful banking reform said so himself. The question is what happened in the 3 years between that secret meeting and 1913, when 2 separate, previously unthinkable powers, a permanent federal income tax and a centralized national banking system, both became law within months of each other, reshaping the basic architecture of the American government's relationship to money in ways most Americans alive today have never been taught in any classroom. Why America had no central bank in 1910 to understand why 6 bankers needed to sneak onto a private train to fix American banking, you have to understand how genuinely broken American banking was by 1907. The United States, alone among major industrial powers by the early 20th century, had no central bank. It had tried twice before the first and second banks of the United States, chartered in 1791 and 1816 respectively, and both times a mix of political opposition, distrust of concentrated financial power, and outright presidential hostility had ended the experiment. For the following 70 years, American banking operated without any central institution capable of acting as what economists call a lender of last resort, an entity that could inject liquidity into the system during a crisis and stop a localized bank run from cascading into a nationwide panic. That structural gap turned catastrophic in October 1907. A failed attempt to corner the market on copper mining stocks triggered a chain reaction of bank runs across New York as depositors, panicked by rumors of insolvency, rushed to withdraw funds from trust companies and banks that under the existing system had no reliable mechanism for accessing emergency liquidity within days. The panic threatened to collapse the entire American financial system. What actually stopped the panic of 1907 is, on its own, a remarkable and slightly uncomfortable historical fact. Not a government agency, not a federal program, but one 70-year-old private citizen. J. Pierpont Morgan, the country's most powerful banker, personally convened meetings of New York's leading financiers in his own private library, coordinated emergency loans, and effectively acted as a one-man central bank to stabilize the system through sheer personal authority and the trust other bankers placed in him. That worked, in the sense that the panic ended without a full collapse. But it left American political and financial leaders with an unsettling realization. The entire stability of the national economy had just depended on the willingness and physical availability of one private individual. Morgan was in his 70s. He would not live forever, and relying on the goodwill of the single wealthiest banker in the country to prevent economic collapse was not. by any reasonable definition, a system. Congress responded by creating a commission to study banking reform, chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a powerful, well-connected legislator with deep ties to the same banking establishment that had just bailed out the country. What that commission actually produced, and how it produced it, is where this story leaves the public record and moves into a private railcar. The meeting at Jekyll Island in November 1910, Senator Aldrich organised a trip that would, in retrospect, become one of the most quietly consequential gatherings in American economic history. The stated purpose given to outsiders was a recreational duck hunting expedition to Jekyll Island. Georgia at the time, home to an exclusive private club frequented by some of the wealthiest families in the country. The actual purpose and the actual attendee list told a very different story. Alongside Aldrich, the group included Abraham Piatt Andrew, then Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank, at the time one of the largest banks in the country, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles Norton, President of First National Bank of New York, and Paul Warburg, a partner at the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and one of the era's leading experts on European-style central banking systems. This was not a gathering of disinterested academic economists. This was a small, hand-picked group representing the most powerful private banking interests in the country, working alongside a sitting US senator and a Treasury official to draft the technical framework for a national banking reform proposal outside of any public committee hearing, outside of open congressional debate, and according to the secrecy measures the group itself adopted, specifically designed to avoid becoming public knowledge before the plan was ready to be presented. Frank Vanderlip's own account, published in his 1935 memoir From Farm Boy to Financier, is the most direct primary source confirmation of what happened and why the secrecy mattered to the men involved. Vanderlip wrote plainly that the group understood if it became known that a small group of bankers had privately drafted a national banking reform plan, the proposal would be politically dead on arrival, discredited before it could even be debated on its own merits, given the intense public suspicion of concentrated Wall Street power that characterized the era's politics. So they didn't let it become known. They traveled under first names only. They avoided being photographed together, and they produced, over roughly a week of work, the technical outline that would become known as the Aldrich Plan. It's worth being precise here about what is documented fact and what would be overreach, the secrecy of the meeting, the identities of the attendees, and the fact that the resulting Aldrich Plan became the substantive basis for the eventual Federal Reserve Act are all well-established historical facts, confirmed by participants' own later accounts and extensively documented by historians. What would be overreach is asserting, without evidence, that this meeting represented some kind of ongoing secret control over the American government by a permanent banking cabal that's a claim beyond what the historical record actually supports, and it's a framing this channel isn't going to make. What the record does support, clearly and without needing embellishment, is that the legal architecture of the institution that still controls American monetary policy today was substantively drafted by private banking interests, in secret, specifically to avoid the public scrutiny that open democratic debate would have brought to the same proposal. The Aldrich Plan itself, when it finally became public in 1911, faced exactly the political backlash its architects had feared, branded by critics as a Wall Street power grab before it ever reached a vote. It failed to pass Congress in its original form. What happened next is the part of this story that most Americans have never heard, how a plan drafted in secret by bankers eventually became law anyway, under a different name, sponsored by the same political party that had spent years attacking it. How the Aldrich Plan became the Federal Reserve, the political irony here is almost too clean to be believable, and it's entirely documented. The Aldrich plan was closely associated with the Republican Party and, specifically, with Wall Street banking interests, which made it politically radioactive after the 1912 elections swept Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party into power on a platform that included explicit criticism of concentrated financial power and Wall Street influence over government. Rather than abandoning central banking reform entirely, Wilson's administration and congressional allies, principally Representative Carter Glass of Virginia and Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma, reworked the substance of the Aldrich plan into a new proposal designed to look, politically, like the opposite of a Wall Street creation. The core technical architecture, a system of regional reserve banks, a mechanism for elastic currency supply, a body to oversee monetary policy, remains substantively similar to what had been drafted at Jekyll Island. What changed was the political packaging. Instead of a single Wall Street adjacent central bank, the new proposal created a network of regional Federal Reserve banks. Technically owned by their member commercial banks, but overseen by a presidentially appointed Federal Reserve Board headquartered in Washington, a hybrid public-private structure specifically designed to blunt the Wall Street control criticism that had killed the Aldrich plan. This is a genuinely important nuance that a purely sensationalized version of this story tends to flatten. The Federal Reserve System that actually became law in 1913 was not identical to the private banker's original proposal. It was a modified, more politically palatable version, shaped by a full and public congressional process hearings, floor debates, competing proposals from agricultural and populist interest groups who wanted less concentrated banking power, not more. The final Federal Reserve Act represented a genuine compromise between the banking industry framework drafted at Jekyll Island and the political demands of a Congress and a president who had campaigned against exactly that kind of concentrated financial influence. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, in a legislative session timed, according to multiple historical accounts, at least partly to secure passage before opponents could mount a final push to delay the vote into the next congressional session. The signing created the Federal Reserve System largely as it still exists today: 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, a board of governors in Washington, and a legal mandate to manage the elasticity of the American currency supply and serve as the lender of last resort that the panic of 1907 had shown the country desperately needed. The Federal Reserve Act wasn't the only fundamental change to the federal government's financial powers to become law around this same narrow window of time. 10 months before Wilson signed the Fed into existence, a second, entirely separate transformation had already been ratified, one that had nothing to do with banks. And everything to do with a power the federal government had been explicitly denied for most of the previous century: the power to tax your income directly. The other 1913, how the income tax became legal for most of American history before 1913, the federal government funded itself primarily through tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes on specific products, not through a direct tax on individual income. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was, at least in part, a specific constitutional limitation. The U.S. Constitution, as originally written, required that any direct tax imposed by the federal government be apportioned among the states according to population, a deliberately cumbersome requirement that made a national income tax, which by nature falls unevenly based on where wealthy individuals happen to live, extremely difficult to implement fairly under that formula. Congress had experimented with income taxes before a temporary tax during the Civil War to fund the Union War effort, which expired in 1872, but a peacetime federal income tax remained, for most of the 1800s, essentially untried. That changed, briefly, in 1894, when Congress passed a new federal income tax as part of a broader tariff reform bill. It lasted less than a year. In 1895, the Supreme Court, in the case Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, ruled that a tax on income derived from property rents, dividends, interest constituted a direct tax under the Constitution's original meaning, and therefore had to be apportioned among the states by population, which effectively made a workable national income tax on that category of earnings unconstitutional as written. The 1894 income tax law was struck down. For the following 14 years, the Supreme Court ruling stood as the primary legal obstacle to a federal income tax until a political coalition, driven partly by progressive-era reformers who wanted a more direct and equitable revenue mechanism than tariffs, built enough momentum to pursue a constitutional amendment specifically designed to override the Pollock decision. Congress passed the proposed 16th Amendment in 1909, explicitly granting Congress the power to levy an income tax without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration language drafted specifically to eliminate the constitutional obstacle the Supreme Court had identified 14 years earlier. Ratification by the required 3/4 of state legislatures took nearly 4 years, a process that unfolded largely outside the national spotlight compared to the more visible and controversial banking reform fight happening in Congress at almost exactly the same time. The 16th Amendment was declared ratified in February 1913, 10 months before Wilson would sign the Federal Reserve Act into law that December. Here's the detail that deserves to sit at the center of this episode, because it's the part almost nobody puts together. In the space of less than a single calendar year, 1913, the federal government of the United States gained two entirely new. Previously, either unconstitutional or practically non-existent powers: the power to tax the income of every American directly, and the power to control the national money supply through a centralized banking system whose foundational legal architecture had been quietly drafted by a small group of private bankers 3 years earlier. Neither of these events caused the other. They weren't part of a single coordinated plan. The income tax amendment moved through Congress and the state ratification process largely independently of the banking reform fight. But their convergence within the same narrow window, at the direct intersection of a government gaining new revenue powers and a private banking sector gaining a formalized, permanent role in managing that revenue's underlying currency, is not something that requires exaggeration to describe as one of the most consequential and least publicly understood years in American financial history. Both changes were passed through entirely legal, constitutionally sound processes, a ratified constitutional amendment, and an act of Congress signed by a sitting president. Neither was secret in its final public form. What was secret was the origin of one half of that equation, and that's a distinction that matters for understanding not just what happened in 1913, but why so few Americans, even those who know the broad outlines of income tax and the Federal Reserve, know the actual sequence of how either one came to exist. What historians still debate more than a century later, the historical interpretation of 1913's dual transformation remains genuinely, legitimately contested among economists and historians, and it's worth being direct about where the real debate sits, rather than flattening it into either uncritical praise or unfounded conspiracy. On one side, mainstream economic historians generally credit the Federal Reserve System, whatever its imperfect origins, with meaningfully reducing the frequency and severity of American banking panics compared to the pre-1913 era, the same kind of catastrophic, cascading bank runs that nearly collapsed the economy in 1907 became substantially less common, though not eliminated, in the decades that followed the Fed's creation. By this account, the Jekyll Island bankers, whatever their private interests, were also responding to a genuine and dangerous structural problem, and the hybrid public-private system that eventually emerged represented a reasonable, historically documented compromise between banking expertise and democratic accountability. On the other side, a persistent and not fringe school of historical and economic criticism argues that the Federal Reserve structure, regional banks nominally owned by their member commercial banks, a degree of operational independence from direct congressional control, and origins substantively shaped by the same banking interests it would go on to regulate, created a system with an inherent structural tension between serving the public interest and serving the interests of the banking industry it oversees. This isn't a fringe conspiracy position, it's a legitimate line of argument made by credentialed economists and historians across the political spectrum, from progressive critics concerned about regulatory capture to free market critics who object to any centralized control of currency at all. What isn't legitimately debatable. Because it's directly documented by a participant's own published account, is that the substantive framework of the law was drafted in deliberate secrecy by private banking interests before it ever became a public legislative proposal. That fact doesn't require an interpretation to be alarming on its own terms, it's simply true, confirmed by Frank Vanderlip in his own words. And it's the reason this story has persisted in public fascination for more than a century, even as the technical details of Federal Reserve monetary policy remain, for most Americans, genuinely difficult to follow. The income tax side of the story carries its own, separate ongoing debate, less about secrecy, since the 16th Amendment process was a fully public constitutional ratification, and more about consequence, how a funding mechanism intended, in part, to shift tax burden away from working-class consumers and toward wealthier income earners evolved, over the following century of legislative amendments, into the far more complex, and by many accounts, far less progressive tax code that exists today. What makes 1913 worth revisiting isn't that either of these two changes was illegitimate. The 16th Amendment passed through the exact constitutional process the founders designed for amending fundamental law. The Federal Reserve Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed by an elected president after a public debate substantial enough to force real changes to the original banking industry proposal. Nothing about the final outcome, in either case, bypassed democracy. What makes it worth revisiting is the part that happened before either of those public processes began the week in November 1910, when 6 men, who understood exactly how unpopular their idea would sound if the public found out who'd written it, boarded a private railcar under false names and built the technical skeleton of an institution that still governs the value of the money in your pocket. More than 110 years later. They weren't hiding a crime, they were hiding an authorship, and it took one of them, writing his own memoir a quarter century later, for that authorship to become part of the public record at all. If you want to look into the primary sources yourself, Frank Vanderlip's 1935 memoir, The Congressional Record from the 1913 Federal Reserve Act debates, and the 16th Amendment ratification history, I've linked what's publicly available in the description. This is documented, verifiable, and still shaping the country a century later. It didn't need a single invented detail to earn its place in this channel's archive.